He grabbed her arm in the middle of the ballroom, not gently, not discreetly, in front of 400 people who all pretended not to see. Marcus Vane's fingers dug into Isabella Marquez's wrist like she was something he owned. His voice was low, but his grip said everything his smile was trying to hide. "You don't walk away from me at my own event, Isabella." She had built her company from nothing. She had negotiated contracts with men twice her age who thought she was decoration. She had survived things Marcus didn't know existed, but she felt her heel catch the hem of her gown as she tried to pull free, and for one terrible second the fabric tore, and Isabella stumbled, and 400 people stopped pretending. If that was you, if that was your wrist, your dress, your dignity, what would you have done? Before you find out what happened next, if these kinds of stories hit you somewhere real, subscribe to this channel and follow Isabella's story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. And drop a like. Then tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Meridian Grand Hotel had a dress code printed on every invitation: black tie, formal attire, no exceptions. Isabella had read that line 3 times before she chose the midnight blue gown. Floor length, structured at the shoulders, a small train that moved like water when she walked. She had not chosen it to impress anyone. She had chosen it because it made her feel like a person who could not be dismissed. That was a feeling she had needed more than usual tonight. The Vane Group's annual charity gala was the kind of event where business got done between the appetizers and the third glass of champagne. Marcus Vane hosted it every year at the Meridian, and every year the city's financial world showed up dressed in its best behavior while the real conversations happened in corners. Isabella had attended twice before, both times on behalf of Marquez Strategic, the consulting firm she had spent 11 years building into something that actually mattered. She was not there as a guest. She was there as someone people needed to know. She had arrived at 8:15 alone. Her assistant had offered to come. She had said no. There were certain rooms Isabella preferred to walk into by herself. It was easier to read the space when you weren't managing someone else's nerves alongside your own. The ballroom was already full. Warm light, low music, the kind of orchestrated elegance that costs more than most people's cars. She had taken a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. Not champagne, never champagne at events like this. She needed her head. And begun the slow circuit of the room that every serious person at a business event eventually makes. Stopping here, nodding there, reading faces, remembering names. She had spoken to Diane Holloway from Coastal Finance. She had exchanged cards with 2 men from a European real estate consortium whose names she immediately locked into memory. She had smiled at the right moments and held her ground at others, and by 9 o'clock she had done what she came to do. She was calculating the least disruptive route to the exit when Marcus Vane appeared. He was not a man who appeared anywhere quietly. He was 53, broad through the shoulders, the kind of handsome that photographs well and wears thin in person. He moved through his own event like he was doing the room a favor, pausing long enough for people to feel noticed, moving on before anyone got comfortable. Isabella had known him professionally for 2 years. She did not like him. She was honest enough with herself to admit that the feeling had very little to do with business. Isabella. He said her name like he was reminding her of it. Marcus. She kept her voice even, professional. It's a beautiful event. You were leaving. I have an early morning. You've been here less than an hour. He tilted his head slightly, amused by something she wasn't in on. That's almost an insult. I've done what I came to do. He smiled. And the smile was the problem, she had always thought, because it never quite reached the eyes. I wanted to talk to you about the Bella Vista proposal. The consortium is ready to move, and your firm's position can be discussed during business hours, she said, through the appropriate channels. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a degree or 2, the way a temperature drops before a storm. I'm offering you a direct conversation, Isabella. That's not something I extend to everyone. She knew that. That was the problem. Marcus Vane's direct conversations came with an architecture underneath them, a set of obligations and expectations that he never stated explicitly and collected on later. She had watched 3 other firms get pulled into that current and lose their footing. She had promised herself she would not be a fourth. "I appreciate it," she said. "Good night, Marcus." She turned. His hand closed around her wrist, not her elbow, the way a colleague might guide someone's attention. Her wrist, below the bracelet, above the pulse, where the grip could be felt without leaving a mark. And his voice dropped into something that was almost gentle, which was worse than if it had been openly aggressive. "I said I wanted to talk to you." She went very still. The kind of stillness that isn't calm, the kind that is the body's first response to danger before the mind catches up. The people nearest them had noticed. She could feel it. The particular quality of nearby silence when other people are pretending very hard not to watch. A woman in red was studying her champagne glass. Two men to the left had found something fascinating about the middle distance. Isabella breathed. "Let go of my wrist," she said quietly. "We're just talking." "Marcus." Her voice did not waver. "Let go." His grip eased, not because he was listening, she understood in that moment, but because he had decided to. That distinction mattered enormously and made her angrier than the grip itself. She pulled her wrist free, turned to move, and her heel, 3 inches, Italian leather, the heel she had worn a dozen times without incident, caught the inside hem of her gown. There was a sound. Soft. Catastrophic. The kind of tearing sound that shouldn't happen in a room this quiet. She lurched forward. Her free hand caught the arm of a chair. Not gracefully, not the way she had trained herself to handle everything, but with the full, ungainly desperation of a person trying not to fall. The chair scraped. Her water glass tilted in her other hand. A few drops splashed her wrist. The same wrist Marcus had been holding, as if the evening wanted to make a point. She did not fall, but she had come close enough that everyone within 15 feet had seen it. The hem of her gown had torn at the back seam. Not catastrophically, it wasn't dragging on the floor, but it had opened a split that exposed her left ankle and ran partway up her calf, and the fabric was now pulling at an angle that made walking without making it worse nearly impossible. She straightened. She released the chair. She held the water glass with a steadiness she did not feel. Marcus was watching her with an expression she could not fully categorize, somewhere between concern and satisfaction, and the mixture made her stomach turn. "Are you all right?" he asked. She did not answer him. She looked around the room because she needed to assess her options, and she was not going to stand in the middle of 400 people doing nothing. The exit was 40 feet away. A service corridor she'd clocked on arrival was closer, maybe 25, but she didn't know if it led anywhere useful. The restrooms were on the far side of the ballroom, which meant crossing the whole room with a torn hem and everyone's politely averted attention following her like a spotlight. None of her options were good. All of them required her to move, and moving meant the fabric was going to pull further with every step. She was calculating, measuring distance, measuring exposure, holding herself completely composed on the outside while her mind ran through the problem like it was a contract dispute, when someone appeared at her left side. Not intrusively, not loudly, just there. "The service corridor," the voice said, low enough for her ears only. "Third door on the left leads to a private parlor. There's a staff member who can help with the dress." She turned. Alessandro Vieri was not looking at her with pity. That was the first thing she registered before she registered anything else. Not pity, not amusement, not the particular look men gave women in moments of vulnerability, as though the vulnerability proved something they'd suspected all along. He was simply looking at her, steady and level, the way you look at someone you're speaking to, and his voice had the same quality, direct, without performance. "I can walk with you," he said, "if you want." Her reaction arrived in pieces, in the wrong order. First, recognition. Alessandro Vieri, 40 years old. The eldest son of Marco Vieri, who had died 4 years ago and left behind a name that made certain rooms go quiet. Alessandro had inherited more than the name. He had inherited the structure beneath it, the businesses, the alliances, the reach. He was known publicly as the chairman of Vieri Holdings, a diversified investment group with interests in real estate, shipping, and private equity. He was known less publicly as the man who controlled the most significant criminal network in the northeastern United States. Isabella knew both things. She had known Alessandro for most of her life, which was a different kind of knowing. Second, the 13 years. 13 years since she had seen him at more than a distance. 13 years since she had been a different person entirely. A 23-year-old still shaped in places by who she'd been at 16, and she had been stupid enough at 16 to write 3 pages of her own heart in careful handwriting and slide it under a door. He had never answered. Not a word. Not even an acknowledgement that she'd done something that took every piece of courage she'd possessed. Third, the anger, which arrived last but landed hardest, the way it always did with Alessandro, like something that had been waiting patiently in a room she kept locked, and all he had to do was stand near enough that she could feel it through the walls. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you're fine." He didn't argue with it, didn't soften it. "The offer stands." Marcus had stepped back. She noticed that without looking directly at him, noticed the slight shift in the air, the way Marcus Vane, who grabbed women's wrists in his own ballroom and thought that was acceptable, had quietly recalibrated in the presence of Alessandro Vieri. That observation sat in the back of her mind like a note she wasn't ready to read. "I don't need—" she started. "Third door," he said again. "I'll be 2 feet to your left. If the fabric pulls, I'll block the angle. No one will see anything." He said it practically, logistically, the way someone describes a route on a map. She hated how much that helped. She hated that practical in this moment from this person was more effective than any amount of warmth would have been. She knew herself well enough to know that warmth would have made her suspicious, would have made her look for what was underneath it. Practical meant he wasn't performing anything. Practical meant she could accept it without it meaning something she didn't want it to mean. She hated Alessandro Vieri with a consistency she had maintained for 13 years, and he had just made it easier to get across a room. "Fine," she said. They walked. He stayed exactly where he said he would, 2 feet to her left, slightly behind, moving at her pace without making a point of it. She kept her spine straight, her chin level, her expression the way she needed it to be. She didn't look at him. She looked at the third door, at the 30 feet between her and it, at the careful management of each step so the fabric didn't catch. No one stopped them. A few eyes tracked the movement. She felt them. But Alessandro's presence did something to the room's social geometry, created a kind of corridor of not looking that she moved through and arrived at the other side of without incident. The parlor behind the third door was small and overdressed, all brocade and good lamps. A staff member, young woman, professional, genuinely helpful in the way that only people who are good at their jobs can manage, appeared within 90 seconds and assessed the situation without any visible alarm. "I can fix this," she said. Isabella sat in the brocade chair the young woman indicated. She kept her back to the door. She did not look to see whether Alessandro had followed her in or stayed outside. She heard after a moment the soft sound of the door closing. When she finally allowed herself to check, because not checking would have been its own kind of dishonesty, she was alone in the room with the staff member, who was already threading a small needle from a kit in her pocket. Alessandro had not come in. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it in the same locked room as all the other things she didn't know what to do with where he was concerned, and she focused on sitting still while the woman repaired her hem, and she breathed, and she told herself the evening was almost over. It was almost over. She was almost free. What she didn't know yet, sitting in that small gilded parlor while someone fixed the dress that Marcus Vane's grip had helped destroy, was that the evening was not almost over. It was barely beginning, and that Alessandro Vieri, standing in the corridor outside a service door in the Meridian Grand Hotel, was standing there long enough that a man who moved through the world with absolute economy of action was doing something he almost never did. He was staying. Isabella sat in the brocade chair for 11 minutes. She knew because she counted, not obsessively, but because counting was something her mind did when it needed to stay inside itself and not reach for the other thing. The staff member, her name was Claire, she'd offered it quietly while working, had the patience of someone trained to fix problems without making people feel like problems, and she worked with a small curved needle and thread she'd matched to the gown's color near perfectly. Isabella watched her hands. She did not think about Alessandro Vieri standing in the corridor. She mostly did not think about it. All done, Claire said, and clipped the thread with a small pair of scissors. She sat back on her heels and looked at the hem with the critical assessment of someone who actually cared about the work. It won't hold forever. The fabric stress is here. She pointed, not touching, just indicating. So if you're dancing, be careful. Walking, you're fine. I'm not dancing, Isabella said. Then you're fine. Isabella stood, smoothed the gown. The repair was nearly invisible. She had to look directly at it to see the slight variation in the stitch pattern, and no one at a gala looked at other people's hemlines that carefully unless they were already looking for something wrong. She breathed. She was fine. She was going to collect her coat and leave, and the evening would be over, and she would spend the drive home deciding how to handle Marcus Vane's behavior in a way that protected her firm's interests without starting a war she didn't have the bandwidth to fight right now. She thanked Claire. She meant it. She opened the parlor door. Alessandro was leaning against the opposite wall of the corridor, arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular the way men who are used to waiting look at nothing. Not bored, just contained. Isabella stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a beat too long. "You're still here," she said. Not a question. A fact stated with the neutrality of someone deciding in real time what to do with it. "You had my jacket," he said. She looked down. She was holding his jacket. She had no memory of how that had happened. He must have placed it over her shoulders at some point in the crossing of the ballroom, the kind of thing her body had accepted without her brain getting a vote. She was holding it folded over her left arm like she'd been carrying it for years. She held it out. He took it. Didn't put it on, just held it by the collar with 2 fingers, the way men held jackets they weren't planning to wear again that night. "Thank you," she said. The 2 words cost her something she didn't have a name for. For earlier. It wasn't a problem. "I didn't say it was a problem for you. I said thank you." Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement. She would have recognized that and known how to dismiss it. Something more careful than amusement. More considered. "You're welcome," he said. She should have walked past him then. The exit was behind him to the left, past the service corridor and back through the edge of the ballroom, and she had her coat check ticket in the small clutch at her wrist, and none of this should have taken another second. She knew all of that. She was extraordinarily clear on all of that. "Did you know he was going to do that?" she said. Alessandro's expression didn't change. "Do what?" "Marcus." She kept her voice even. Not accusatory, just requiring. "Grab me. Was that something you knew was coming?" "No." "You were nearby very quickly." "I was nearby because I was watching him." He said it without apology, without explanation beyond the fact itself. He does that at these events, takes hold of things he's decided belong to him. I've seen it before. The corridor was quiet. The sounds of the ballroom were muffled by 2 doors and 20 feet. Music and low voices and the clink of things that cost money, all of it reduced to a murmur that made the corridor feel like a different country. "So you were watching him," Isabella said. "Not me." "Both." She absorbed that, filed it, did not allow herself to examine what filing it meant. "Why?" she said. Alessandro looked at her with the directness that had always been his most disorienting quality, the thing about him that had no performance underneath it, no calculation, which should have made him easier to read and somehow made him harder. "Because you walked into a room where Marcus Vane hosts the event, and you're the best negotiator in the city, and he's been trying to get your firm into his orbit for 8 months, and you've said no every time. Men like Marcus don't accept no the same way from women as they do from other men. I know that. I know you know it. Then what you're saying is you were watching because you thought I couldn't handle it." "I was watching because I thought he might do something stupid," Alessandro said. "You handled it. He was stupid anyway. Those are different things." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw was tight. She could feel the tension there, the physical evidence of the argument she was running inside herself between the part that wanted to take the answer at face value and the part that had been building a case against Alessandro Vieri for 13 years, and wasn't ready to dismiss the charges on the strength of one corridor conversation. "You should get back to your evening," she said. "Probably." "I'm leaving." "I'll walk you out." "That's not—" "The ballroom floor between here and the coat check," he said. "Marcus is still in there. If he sees you leaving alone, he may decide to try again." He held her gaze. "I'm not suggesting you can't manage it. I'm telling you the situation and offering to be useful. You can tell me no." She wanted to tell him no. The want was specific and physical, located somewhere in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight until right now when she could put it down and chose not to. "Fine," she said. Again. The same word she'd given him in the ballroom, in the same tone, which meant something about her and Alessandro that she refused to examine in a service corridor at 9:45 on a Thursday night. They walked back through the ballroom. He was beside her this time, not behind. Same 2 feet, same quality of presence that moved the room's attention without demanding it. She retrieved her coat. He stood slightly to her left while she signed the receipt. Marcus Vane was visible on the far side of the room, engaged with a group of men in gray suits, and his eyes found Isabella once. She felt the look before she saw it, and then moved to Alessandro and stayed there for exactly 1 second before looking away. That 1 second said everything. The lobby air was cooler. Isabella stopped at the top of the front steps, where the valet line curved around the drive, and turned to Alessandro. "I drive myself," she said. "I remember." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I remember that you drive yourself. You've driven yourself since you were 17. You told me once it was the only place you could think without someone interrupting the thought." He said it plainly, like a fact he'd stored without deciding to, without realizing she'd need to know he'd stored it. "It's been 13 years, Isabella. I still remember things." The air between them had changed temperature. She was sure she was the only one who noticed, because she was the only one with a 13-year inventory of the ways Alessandro Vieri could rearrange her equilibrium without appearing to try. She was 36 years old. She ran a firm with 42 employees. She had sat across from men who controlled 9-figure accounts and held her position through sheer prepared refusal to flinch. And Alessandro Vieri, standing on the steps of the Meridian Grand Hotel in a tuxedo he was carrying like a second skin, had just told her he remembered a detail she'd shared when she was 17 years old, and her whole chest had moved without her permission. "Good night, Alessandro," she said. "Good night." She went down the steps. She gave her ticket to the valet. She stood with her coat around her shoulders and waited for her car and did not look back at the top of the steps to see if he was still standing there. Her car arrived in 4 minutes. She got in. She pulled out of the drive. At the first traffic light she stopped at, 2 blocks from the hotel, she let out a breath she'd been holding for she didn't know how long. It came out shakier than she expected. She gripped the steering wheel with both hands, felt the texture of it, made herself focus on that. Her wrist hurt where Marcus had held it. That was the thing she should be focusing on. Marcus Vane and what tonight meant for the Belvista negotiations, and whether she needed to document the incident or whether documentation would invite a counter-narrative she wasn't prepared to battle. Those were the actual problems. Those were the things that were real and present and within her ability to address. She drove home and told herself this was fine. Etienne, the Belvista Vineyard project entered her professional life 11 days later, wearing the disguise of an opportunity. Her contact at Meridian Pacific, a development consortium she'd been building a relationship with for 2 years, called with a straightforward pitch: a luxury vineyard and resort property north of the city, 93 acres of producing vines and an existing estate structure that needed significant capital and operational expertise to reach its potential. The consortium had the capital. They needed a strategic partner who understood both the hospitality sector and the kind of high-net-worth relationships that drove premium wine tourism. Marquez Strategic was, according to her contact, at the top of their list. Isabella spent 2 days running the numbers. She spent another day assessing the consortium's financial structure. By the 4th day, she was ready to say yes, which was not a word she used quickly or carelessly. She called her contact and said it. "Wonderful," he said, and then paused in the way that people pause when they're getting to the part they held back until the yes was in place. "I should mention, there's a co-investment partner in the project. Vieri Holdings. Alessandro Vieri will be at the initial meeting. Isabella held the phone and said nothing for 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than she usually allowed silence on a business call. "When's the meeting?" she said. "Thursday, 10 o'clock. "I'll be there," she said. She spent Thursday morning in her office going over the project files for the third time, which was not something she needed to do and which she recognized as a behavior pattern, the compulsive preparation that her therapist had once, carefully, described as a way of creating the illusion of control over uncontrollable situations. Dr. Reyes had been correct. Isabella had acknowledged she was correct and continued doing it anyway, because the files were better than sitting with the actual question, which was why she had said yes to a project before knowing all the terms. She knew why. She had said yes because the project was genuinely good, because the numbers worked, because Marquez Strategic was precisely positioned to deliver value on this specific type of engagement, and walking away from good work because one person made her uncomfortable was not something she was willing to do. She told herself this in exactly those terms, twice, while she put on the charcoal suit that made her feel competent and walked to the elevator. The meeting was at Meridian Pacific's offices, 15th floor, glass conference room. Isabella arrived 8 minutes early. Alessandro was already there, standing at the window with a cup of coffee, reading something on his phone with the focused attention he gave everything. Not performative focus, not the kind men used in meetings to signal their importance, but the genuine kind that meant he actually read what was in front of him. He looked up when she came in. "Isabella." "Alessandro." They shook hands. The handshake lasted exactly the right amount of time, the precise professional duration that communicated nothing except that they were both aware of how precisely calibrated it was, which communicated everything. The other parties filed in over the next 6 minutes. Martin Chu from Meridian Pacific ran the meeting with the efficient competence of someone who'd done this 100 times and had learned that the cleanest presentations were ones where you let the numbers do most of the talking. Isabella paid close attention to structure, how he framed the opportunity, which risks he named first, what he buried in slide 14, what he'd left out of the deck that she knew was in the raw data she'd reviewed. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise. All of them, she noticed from her peripheral vision, watched carefully by Alessandro. He asked 2. Both of them went to places Martin hadn't expected. She could see the slight recalibration in Martin's face, the mental shifting of weight, as he answered. Alessandro's questions were good. She hated that they were good. She had spent enough years managing her reactions to him that she had a reasonably accurate inventory of which things about him made her angry, and which made her angry because she respected them, and this was the second kind. After the meeting, while Martin was handling the logistics of getting everyone their documents and business cards were exchanged with the other members of the consortium, Alessandro came to stand next to her at the far end of the table. Not close, not invading anything, just near enough for a private conversation. "The revenue model in slide 9, he said quietly. "The occupancy projections are optimistic," she said, "by about 12% if they're using regional comp data. The Belvista location isn't comparable to what's within 50 miles. It's more isolated, which is an asset for the premium segment, but a drag on mid-tier volume." "I thought the same." "Did you mention it?" "I was going to." He picked up the bound presentation from the table. "You mentioned the asset positioning first. I followed up on implementation rather than redundancy." She looked at him. "You adjusted your question because I'd already covered the territory. It was more efficient. Or you were deciding whether I was competent before you committed your own resources to saying the same thing." He met her eyes. "Would you prefer I'd spoken first and you'd followed up?" The question wasn't defensive. It was genuine, direct in the way that was either his best quality or his most effective weapon, and after all these years, she genuinely didn't know which. "I'd prefer transparency about the dynamic," she said. "The dynamic is that we're going to be working on the same project, and we both assess the same weakness independently, which suggests our analytical frameworks are compatible." He paused. "That's useful information." "It's also useful information that you waited to see what I'd say first." "Yes," he said. "It is." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Out the glass wall of the conference room, the city arranged itself 15 floors below. Organized, purposeful, indifferent. She breathed. "We should have a meeting," she said. "Separate from the consortium to align on approach." Agreed. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket. She knew the card before she saw it. Same design he'd used for years. Simple. The kind of understated that costs more than pretending to be understated. "My direct line is on the back." She took the card. Did not look at the back. Put it in her portfolio. "Thursday," she said. "My office." "Fine." She collected her things and left the conference room first, which she did not examine for motive. He came to her office that Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, and they sat across her desk from each other with a project brief between them and the full 13 years of their history somewhere in the walls of the room, and they worked. That was the part that surprised her. Not the tension. She'd expected tension, had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, with data, an agenda, and a clear objective for the meeting. What she hadn't prepared for was how well they worked, how their pacing matched, how when she was thinking through a problem out loud, he didn't interrupt with his answer. He waited, and then he added, and what he added was almost always the thing she'd been reaching toward. It annoyed her deeply. It annoyed her because it was easier than she'd built her defenses for. And easy from Alessandro felt like a trap, and she had spent 13 years maintaining the certainty that Alessandro Vieri was someone she needed to be defended against. The certainty was load-bearing. If she removed it, she didn't know what was underneath. They met 4 times in the next 2 weeks. Her office, his office, a working lunch at a restaurant near the project attorney's building, a site visit to Bella Vista itself on a gray Tuesday morning where the vines were dormant and the estate building smelled like cold stone and old wood. Each meeting pushed the project forward and did nothing to resolve the other thing, the thing neither of them named, which was that they were 2 people with a history that one of them remembered as a wound and the other apparently remembered as simply history. At the 3rd meeting, in his office, she'd made a comment about the estate's event infrastructure that he disagreed with. Not aggressively. He rarely did anything aggressively in conversation, which was its own kind of power. He simply laid out his reasoning, point by point, and waited. She'd pushed back. He'd held his position. She'd pushed harder, using data she'd compiled that morning specifically because she'd anticipated this argument. He'd read the data, sat with it, and said, "You're right about the fixed cost structure. I was wrong about the scalability threshold." She'd sat very still for a moment. "Say that again," she said. He looked at her. "I was wrong." "I know, I just—" She stopped, reorganized. "Men in your position don't usually say that. In my position, being wrong and not knowing it gets people hurt." He said it without drama, just fact. "I'd rather say it." She had looked at him across his desk. The good suit, the controlled stillness, the eyes that had never once, in all the years she'd known him, given her the performance version of anything. And she had felt the wall she'd built move. Not fall, not crack dramatically, just move. The way a heavy thing shifts when someone touches it with the right amount of patient, consistent pressure. It frightened her. It frightened her enough that she'd ended the meeting 8 minutes early with an excuse about another call, and Alessandro had said nothing about the early ending, and she'd gone back to her office and sat at her desk and told herself she needed to get this under control. She told herself that for 6 days. On the 7th day, Raphael called. Her brother's name on her screen at 7 in the morning on a Saturday was not itself alarming. Raphael called at strange hours because he'd never adjusted to the idea that other people structured their time differently. He was 44, 3 years older than her, still operating on the same cheerful schedule disorder that had driven their mother to distraction when they were children. Isabella picked up. "Tell me you're not at the office," he said. "I'm at home." "You're at home with your laptop open, working on something." She looked at her laptop. "What do you want, Raphael?" He laughed. The laugh was her brother's. Easy, real, the sound of someone who had never quite figured out that life required more armor than he brought to it. She loved him for it and found it exhausting in equal measure. "I'm having people over tonight," he said. "You should come." "Who's people?" "People. Friends. Marco and his wife, Elena, the Caruso brothers, if they can make it." He paused. Alessandro. She set down her coffee cup with more precision than the action required. Raphael. She's been my best friend for 30 years, Isabella. I know who Alessandro Vieri is. You've been working together on this vineyard thing for 2 weeks. You can sit in the same room over pasta. I sit in the same room with him regularly. It's called a meeting. This has chairs and also sauce, Raphael said. It's not complicated. She looked out the window. The Saturday morning light was coming in at the angle that made her apartment look better than it was. Warmer, more settled, the kind of light that made staying seem easier than going. 7 o'clock, Raphael said. She said yes because saying no to Raphael required a specific allocation of energy she hadn't budgeted for a Saturday morning, and because she could hear in his voice the particular brightness that meant he was happy she'd answered, and she was not ready to be the thing that dimmed it. She spent the rest of the day pretending she wasn't thinking about it. Raphael's apartment was in the old part of the city, a converted building with thick walls and tall windows, and a kitchen that smelled permanently like something good. By the time Isabella arrived at 7:15, there were already 8 people distributed across the living room and kitchen, the warm noise of a gathering that had started before it was supposed to. Raphael met her at the door with his arms already open. She let him hug her. She didn't do it graciously. She never did. She'd been allergic to demonstration since childhood. But she did it. You came, he said. I said I would. You say you will. And then your phone mysteriously needs attention, and then you're sorry you couldn't make it. I'm here, Raphael. He took her coat. She moved into the room, exchanged hellos with faces she knew and names she'd kept in storage. Marco Di Luca and his wife Stephanie. Elena Vasquez, who'd been Raphael's colleague for a decade. 2 men she didn't know who turned out to be the Caruso brothers, one of whom was actually pleasant, and one of whom was not. Alessandro arrived at 7:40. She knew because she heard the change in the room's texture, a slight realignment, the way air moves when something significant enters the space. She was in the kitchen pretending to help Elena with the salad, which meant she had her back to the door, which meant she heard Raphael's greeting before she turned. Finally, Raphael said, Isabella's here. She turned around with a bowl of salad and a serving fork, and the very specific expression of someone who was absolutely fine. Alessandro was looking at her from across the apartment. He wore a dark sweater, no jacket, which was the most informal she'd seen him in 13 years. He looked. She was not going to follow that thought to its end. He looked like himself, but without the professional armor, and that was worse in a way she hadn't anticipated. Isabella, he said. Same way he always said it. Alessandro. Same way she always answered. Raphael looked between them with the transparent excitement of a man who thought he was being subtle. The evening moved forward in the way evenings at Raphael's always moved. Too much food, too many overlapping conversations, the kind of warmth that only happened when nobody was trying to produce it. Isabella sat between Elena and Marco's wife through most of dinner, kept both conversations alive, ate the pasta that was as good as Raphael's pasta always was. She was aware of Alessandro across the table the way she was always aware of Alessandro. Not constantly, but with the precision of something calibrated, her attention checking his position periodically like a navigation instrument confirming a known landmark. He talked mostly to Raphael and Marco. He was different here than in meetings. Less contained, not loose exactly, but with more space in him, room for the dry humor she'd forgotten he had, the kind that didn't announce itself. Marco said something about a renovation project that had gone predictably wrong, and Alessandro said something so dryly accurate that the whole table laughed before half of them understood why, and Isabella caught herself smiling before she could stop it. She looked down at her plate. After dinner, Raphael corralled most of the table into the living room for something involving cards. Isabella stayed in the kitchen to help clear, and by the time she'd finished there were only 2 people left at the table, her and Alessandro. He was still sitting with his wine, not pretending to do anything else, not performing indifference, just sitting with his wine and looking at her with the directness that she needed to develop a better immune response to. You're thinking, he said. I'm usually thinking. Specifically about something at the table. Is this something you do? She said. Read people. I watch how people hold their faces when they think no one is looking. He turned his wine glass once, slowly. You went somewhere for about 30 seconds while Marco was talking. You came back when I said something that made Raphael laugh. She sat down. She hadn't meant to sit down. Her body had simply done it, and rather than make it a thing, she stayed. I forgot you were funny, she said. I'm not often funny in meetings. No, she looked at him. You're not often anything in meetings. You're strategic. And here? She picked up her own wine. Here you're... She stopped. What? He said. Different. The word came out before she'd approved it. She felt the word hanging in the air between them and did not chase after it. Alessandro looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving in his expression. She could see it the way you can see something moving in deep water, knowing it's there without being able to make out the shape. He set down his glass. Isabella, he said, why do you hate me? The question landed like a flat stone on still water, not hostile, not wounded, just asked, direct, the way he asked everything, as though he had decided the answer mattered more than the strategy of how to get it. She opened her mouth, closed it. In the living room, Raphael laughed at something, the sound of it bright and carrying, and it was so perfectly Raphael, so completely her brother, so present and uncomplicated and full of love for the world, that something shifted in Isabella's chest that she was not ready for. Because Raphael was laughing in the next room, and Isabella was sitting at his kitchen table, and Alessandro Vieri was looking at her and asking why she hated him, and she had carried the answer to that question for 13 years like a stone in her pocket, never telling anyone, never putting it down, and she felt it now with a specificity that surprised her. The weight of it, the sharpness of it, the way it had shaped everything else she carried. There was a letter, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, steadier than she deserved. Alessandro went very still. When I was 16, she said, I wrote you a letter. He didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes stayed on her with an attention so complete it was almost pressure. I left it under your door, she said. That summer. The summer before you left for... It doesn't matter. I left it, and you never said anything. And I spent the next 13 years understanding that you'd read it and decided it wasn't worth a response. She picked up her wine glass and then set it down without drinking. I built a lot of things on top of that understanding. It's a structural element at this point. The silence between them was so specific she could feel its edges. Alessandro said, What door? Your bedroom door, at your parents' house, the last week of August. His brow drew together. Not in dismissal, not in confusion as performance, but in the focused, slightly troubled look of someone trying to locate a memory that should be there and finding the space where it should be unexpectedly empty. Isabella, he said slowly, I never received a letter. She looked at him. He looked back. And from the living room came the sound of Raphael's voice, rising above the others, saying something that made everyone laugh again. Her brother's voice. Her brother's laugh. Her brother who had been Alessandro's best friend for 30 years, and who had been 17 years old that summer, and who had always been too protective of her for his own good and hers. Isabella felt the understanding arrive in her body before her mind caught up to it, arriving the way cold water arrives, suddenly and everywhere at once. And she looked at Alessandro Vieri across her brother's kitchen table and felt 13 years of careful, load-bearing certainty begin to come apart at the seams. The sound of Raphael's laugh carried through the wall like something from a different world. Isabella sat with it for 3 full seconds. The laugh, the warmth of it, the way it had always been the most honest sound in any room her brother occupied, and felt it change shape inside her chest as the understanding finished arriving. Alessandro was watching her face. She knew he was watching because she could feel the quality of his attention, the particular stillness of a man who had learned to read situations by reading the people inside them. And right now the situation was her expression doing something she couldn't control. Isabella. His voice was careful, not soft. Alessandro Vieri did not do soft in the way people meant when they said the word, but careful, calibrated to the specific weight of the moment. Give me a second, she said. She needed more than a second. She needed to dismantle and rebuild a 13-year structure in a kitchen that smelled like garlic and good wine while her brother laughed 20 feet away. She was not going to get what she needed. She breathed instead. Raphael was 17 that summer, she said. Not to Alessandro. More to herself, the way you say a fact out loud to make sure it stays a fact and doesn't turn into something you've imagined. He found you first every morning that whole August. He always thought he knew what was best for me. Alessandro set down his wine glass, both hands flat on the table now, just resting there, not reaching for anything. You think Raphael intercepted the letter? I think Raphael found a letter from his 16-year-old sister outside his best friend's door and made a decision. She felt the sentence in her throat as she said it, each word with its own particular texture, the specific grit of it. I think he made it for what he believed were good reasons, and I think I spent 13 years building my life around the consequence of it without ever knowing the cause. Alessandro's jaw tightened. It was a small movement. On someone else, she might not have noticed it. On Alessandro, who rarely allowed any involuntary movement anywhere in his face, it was significant. You need to ask him, he said. I know. Tonight. I know, Alessandro. She pushed her chair back. Her legs were steady. She was grateful for that, the specific mercy of a body that understood that this was not the moment to fail her. She walked to the kitchen doorway. The living room beyond it was all warm light and the scattered noise of people who liked each other, Raphael at the center of it, the way he always was, holding a hand of cards and saying something that made Elena cover her mouth laughing. She looked at her brother for a moment. He glanced up and found her across the room the way he'd always been able to find her in a crowd, some fraternal instinct, some leftover of childhood proximity. He smiled at her. The smile that meant he was glad she was there. The smile that was just purely Raphael, no agenda in it, no subtext. She walked toward him and the smile changed. He read her face the way he'd always read it, better than almost anyone, and the cards lowered slightly and the warmth in his eyes became something more watchful. Hey, he said, you okay? Can I talk to you? She said. Somewhere quiet. Raphael's second bedroom was where he kept the things that didn't have a place. Boxes from the last move, a guitar he'd played for 2 years and abandoned, a desk that served as overflow storage. He turned on the lamp on the desk and closed the door and turned to face her with the posture of a man who already knew, on some level, that the conversation was going to cost him something. What's going on? He said. I need you to tell me something true, Isabella said, and I need you to not manage how you tell it, not soften it, not explain it before you say it. Just say it. He crossed his arms, not defensive. She could read the difference with Raphael, had been reading him her whole life, more like he was holding himself together while he waited to see what direction the blow was coming from. That summer, she said, when I was 16. August. His face did something very small, almost imperceptible. But she had been reading Raphael's face since she was 3 years old, and she saw it. I left a letter, she said. Outside Alessandro's door. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Raphael's arms tightened slightly across his chest. He looked at a point just past her left shoulder. Not avoiding, exactly, more like he was finding something to focus on while he loaded up to speak. Raphael, she said, Isabella, did you take it? 3 seconds. 3 of the longest seconds she'd spent in a room in years, and she'd spent a significant number of long seconds in rooms. She was used to silences as negotiating tools, as weapons, as the space where people revealed what they actually meant. This silence was different. This silence was her brother deciding whether to let her finally know the truth of something, and she could see the decision happening in his face, the way the pieces of it moved. Yes, he said. One word, flat, like he'd been waiting a long time to say it and had imagined it happening differently, and this was what he got. Isabella stood in that room with her brother's yes in the air between them and felt something go through her that she didn't have a clean name for. Not just anger. Anger was too simple, too single-noted for what this was. It was more like a sensation of the floor beneath multiple floors giving way simultaneously, the kind of structural failure that doesn't announce itself until you're already in the middle of it. Why? She said. You were 16. That is not an answer. You were 16 and you were in love with my best friend who was 21 and about to become... He stopped. His jaw worked. I knew what Alessandro was going to inherit. I knew what his life was going to look like. The family, everything that came with it. And you were 16, Isabella, and you were the most brilliant person I knew, and I didn't want that letter to start something that was going to pull you into his world. She breathed through her nose, controlled. So you decided. I was trying to protect you. You decided, she said again, louder, without asking me, without telling me. You decided that I was too young to handle whatever his answer was going to be, and you took the choice away from me. You were 16. You keep saying that. Her voice was shaking now, slightly, at the edges of the words. Not from grief, from the specific vibration of a fury that has been stored for too long in too small a space. I was 16 and I was not stupid and I was not fragile, Raphael. I was 16 and I made a decision and you unmade it for me without my knowledge. And then you watched me spend 13 years. She stopped. The sentence was too long and too full of things. She chose the part that mattered most. I thought he rejected me. I thought I put everything I had into 3 pages, and he decided I wasn't worth the time to respond. Raphael's face had changed completely. The warm easiness that was his natural expression had been replaced by something that looked like genuine suffering, and she registered that she was causing it, and she felt no impulse to stop. I didn't think about it that way, he said. His voice had gone rough. No. You thought about it as protecting me. You didn't think about what I'd build on top of the silence. She pressed her fingers against her sternum, not dramatic, just locating herself. I became who I became because I thought Alessandro Vieri read my letter and threw it away. I made myself someone who didn't need anyone to choose her. I made that my project for 13 years. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Raphael was quiet. His eyes were wet. She could see it in the lamplight. The specific brightness of tears he was not going to let fall, because Raphael had always cried privately, had always taken his grief somewhere she couldn't follow it. He looked at her with something in his face that was beyond apology. An apology names a wrong and asks to be relieved of it. What she was seeing in her brother's face was something heavier, something that understood no relief was available. I'm sorry, he said. I know. Isabella, I know, Raphael. The words came out more tired than angry now. The anger was still there, but the energy underneath it had shifted, redistributed itself. I need you to just stand here with that for a minute. I'm not asking you to fix it. I don't think it can be fixed right now. I just needed you to say it. He nodded. He stood there. His arms had dropped to his sides. He'd stopped holding himself together and was letting whatever was happening to him happen. She looked at him for a long moment. Her brother at 44, who had always loved her too fiercely and too clumsily and with too much confidence in his own ability to determine what was good for her, who had sat across from her at 100 dinners and never said a word, who had kept this specific piece of her history from her because he'd decided, at 17 with 17's understanding of the world, that she was better off not knowing. She didn't forgive him, not in that room, not that night. She didn't have access to forgiveness yet. It was somewhere further along a road she hadn't started walking. But she looked at him and recognized, underneath the fury and the grief and the 13-year accounting of what his silence had cost her, that she still knew the difference between a person who had hurt her carelessly and a person who had hurt her because they loved her badly. The distinction did not make it better, but it made it something she might be able to move through eventually. I need to get some air, she said. Okay. Don't tell anyone what we talked about. He nodded. She left the room. Well, Alessandro was in this kitchen where she'd left him, standing now, jacket on, which meant he'd been preparing to leave or preparing for something. He looked at her when she came through the doorway and read whatever her face was doing with the same economy he brought to everything. He didn't ask, he just waited. He took it, she said. Alessandro closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then he opened them. I see. He was 17 and he thought he was protecting me. She heard her own voice, flat, dry, slightly wrecked. He destroyed it before you ever had a chance to read it. Isabella. Don't. She put her hand up. Don't say anything kind right now. I don't have the... I can't receive it right now. He was quiet. He accepted the limit without making it a thing. She stood in her brother's kitchen and looked at the table where the wine glasses were still sitting, where she'd been sitting 20 minutes ago when the floor had started to give way, and she thought about the specific mathematics of what she'd just learned. 13 years of distance. 13 years of a defense she'd built on a foundation that turned out to be nothing. No rejection, no silence, no deliberate disregard. Just her brother's 17-year-old hand closing around 3 pages of her handwriting and making them disappear. "I need to know something," she said. Alessandro waited. "That summer, when I was 16. She made herself look at him directly. It cost her something, but she paid it. "You said you didn't receive the letter, but did you notice anything? Was it obvious? What I felt?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "It was obvious." She absorbed that. "And you were 16, he said. "And I was 21, and I was about to take on responsibilities that I understood were dangerous and permanent. And you were my best friend's sister." He paused. "And I made a decision too. Mine was to not act on what I saw. I told myself it was the right decision. I still think it was the right decision for who we both were then." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, not quite vulnerable, but something in the neighborhood of it, something adjacent to honesty that was more than just factual accuracy. "I didn't anticipate what the silence would cost you. I didn't know about the letter. I thought things would clarify." "And did they?" she said. "You became someone who looked at me like I'd done something to her that I couldn't account for," he said, "and I spent years not understanding why." She looked at him for a long time. "I have to go," she said. "I can't. I need to be somewhere that isn't here right now." "Okay." "The Belvista meeting is Monday." "I know." She picked up her bag from the counter. She put on her coat that she'd retrieved from somewhere. She couldn't remember exactly when. Her body had been operating on its own resources for the past 40 minutes. She walked past Alessandro toward the front door and then stopped with her hand on the door frame. "Alessandro." "Yes." She didn't turn around. "If you had read it, if Raphael hadn't taken it, what would you have done?" The silence lasted long enough that she was going to release the question, let it stay unanswered, move through the door and into the night. Then he said, "I don't know what I would have done at 21. A pause. "I know what I would do now." She left. The following week was the longest Isabella had worked through in recent memory, and she'd had weeks that ended with her sleeping on the small couch in her office because going home seemed like too large a distance to travel. She put everything she had into the Belvista project, into the revenue modeling, the vendor negotiations, the early-stage event programming that would define the property's identity in the premium hospitality market. She worked 12-hour days and then came home and lay in bed looking at the ceiling with the specific clarity of a person who has resolved every professional question and left the personal ones completely open. She did not call Raphael. He called twice, left voicemails that were short and careful, none of his usual verbal overflow, just his name and "call me when you're ready." She was not ready. She was not close to ready. She put the voicemails in the same locked room as everything else and went back to work. Alessandro she saw Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The Belvista rhythm they'd established, the structured regularity of a project that needed both of them and didn't care about their history. He came to her office Monday, and they worked through the vendor contracts for 3 hours, and he was the same. That was the thing. He was the same Alessandro she'd been working with for weeks. Direct, precise, patient with complexity, impatient with imprecision. He treated her exactly the same as he had before Raphael's kitchen table. He did not reference what had happened. He did not handle her with the slightly increased gentleness that people used on people who had recently received difficult news, which she had always hated, the way it marked you as temporarily fragile. She was grateful for it in a way that made her more confused, not less. On Friday, she was going over the estate's hospitality licensing requirements when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. She looked. 3 words. "We need to talk." Below it, a name she recognized immediately, and not from anything good. Dominic Vane. Marcus Vane's younger brother, who ran the operational side of the Vane Group and who had, according to every reputable source she'd ever consulted, significantly fewer scruples than his brother and a longer memory for slights. She stared at the text for a moment. Then she replied, "About what?" His answer took 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, she finished the paragraph she'd been reading, looked out the window, and told herself not to catastrophize. His answer arrived. The Bella Vista investment, and what Alessandro Vieri is actually doing with it. She read it twice. She put the phone face down on her desk. She breathed through it, the specific practiced breathing of someone who has learned that the first 30 seconds of alarm are the least useful, and that what comes after, if you wait, is information. She'd learned it from a negotiation consultant 8 years ago, and it was one of the most valuable things she owned. After 30 seconds, she turned the phone over and typed, "If you have something to say it. I don't meet without an agenda." He sent an address, a coffee place on the west side of the city, neutral, public, no associations she recognized. He sent a time, Sunday at 10. She sat with it for most of Friday afternoon. She ran Dominic Vane through every professional contact and public record she could access, and found what she already knew: operational head of the Vane Group, 46, no criminal record that was visible, a reputation for aggressive negotiating that had cost 2 mid-sized firms their stability in the past 3 years. Connected to Marcus, operating in the same ecosystem as Alessandro, but on the competing edge of it. The text could be nothing: a fishing expedition, a competitor trying to introduce doubt about a business partner before a major project reached its critical phase. She'd seen that maneuver before. It was common enough to have a name in deal-making circles. The text could also be something. She went Sunday. The coffee place was small, good, busy enough that 2 people could have a private conversation without being the most interesting thing in the room. Dominic Vane was already there when she arrived, 50 years old, in a face that had lived harder than it photographed. Dark coat, hands around a coffee cup, watching the door. He stood when she came in. She did not offer her hand. "Miss Marquez." He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. She did not order anything. She put her bag on the table to her right, within reach, and looked at him. "Say what you came to say," she said. He appreciated directness. She could tell by the slight recalibration, the settling into the conversation. "Alessandro Vieri is using Bella Vista as a consolidation vehicle," he said, "not for legitimate hospitality investment. He's been acquiring land access rights through a chain of shell entities, 3 of which use Bella Vista's property as collateral that the consortium doesn't know about. By the time the project reaches Phase 2, he'll have leveraged your firm's credibility and Meridian Pacific's capital against a debt structure that serves his other interests and leaves the legitimate partners holding exposure." He said it cleanly. No embellishment, no visible emotion, the way you said a thing you'd rehearsed and wanted to sound like you hadn't. Isabella sat with it. She did not react. She was very good at not reacting, and right now not reacting was the only defensible position, because she did not know yet whether what she was hearing was true, and until she knew that, any visible response was information she was giving away for free. "Documentation," she said. He reached into his coat and slid a folder across the table. She opened it. Shell entity filings, 3 of them. Property cross-collateralization documents. A transaction record from 8 weeks ago, 2 weeks before she'd formally joined the Bella Vista project, showing a lien instrument against the estate property that no one in the consortium had been disclosed. She read it carefully. She read it the way she read everything important, not for the story it was telling, but for the inconsistencies in how it told the story. Dates, jurisdictions, the names of signing attorneys. She had a lawyer's patience for documents without having a lawyer's credentials, which had served her better than credentials in 3/4 of the situations it had ever mattered. The documents looked real. She closed the folder. "Why are you bringing this to me?" she said. Dominic Vane picked up his coffee cup. "Because Alessandro Vieri has been using the legitimacy of the Meridian Pacific Consortium as cover for asset consolidation that directly competes with the Vane Group's regional interests. And because you're the partner with the most to lose if this goes wrong, which means you're the partner with the most incentive to act before it does." "That's what's true for you," she said. "Tell me what's true for you." He looked at her. Slight smile, appreciation, or the simulation of it. We want Vieri out of the Belvista deal. If he's exposed as having encumbered project assets without disclosure, the consortium will remove him. That creates an opening. The Vane Group would step in as replacement co-investor. Everyone's protected. Project continues. Except Alessandro. Except Vieri, he agreed, who was apparently not transparent with his partners. She looked at the folder. She looked at Dominic Vane. She said, "I'll need 3 days to verify the documentation independently." Of course. She picked up the folder. She stood. She put on her coat. Miss Marquez. He was watching her from his seat, one hand still around the cup. Alessandro Vieri is a man with very sophisticated instincts for self-preservation. Whatever personal history you may have, and I understand there's some, it won't factor into how he prioritizes his own interests if this deal turns. She looked at him for a moment. "I'll be in touch," she said. She walked out of the coffee place into the gray Sunday morning air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, folder in her hand, the traffic moving past her in both directions, the city doing what it always did, continuing, indifferent, full of people navigating their own complicated arrangements of loyalty and interest and old damage. She thought about Alessandro at Raphael's kitchen table saying, "I know what I would do now." She thought about the documents in the folder, the dates, the attorneys' names, the specific plausibility of the shell entity structure. She thought about Marcus Vane's hand on her wrist and his brother's careful, rehearsed delivery, and the way this felt. Not like protection, not like a colleague with genuine concern, but like a move in a game she hadn't known she was sitting at the table of until just now. She thought about the fact that she had spent 13 years building herself into someone who didn't need to trust anyone, and that this specific moment on this specific sidewalk was the thing that had always been waiting for all that work. She had 3 days to find out whether Alessandro Vieri had been using her, and whether everything that had happened between them since the Meridian Gala had been, in some essential way, part of the architecture of that use. She started walking. She told herself she needed the truth before she made any decision. She told herself she was a professional with obligations to her firm and her partners, and that sentiment had no place in the assessment of documented evidence. She told herself all of it and believed most of it, and underneath all of it was the thing she couldn't strategize around, the thing she couldn't file in a locked room or breathe through or manage with preparation and distance. She was terrified that the documents were real. And she was more terrified of what it would mean if the one person she'd spent 13 years defending herself against had, in the end, been worth defending herself from all along. She spent Sunday night not sleeping, not the restless half-sleep she sometimes fell into during heavy project periods, where the mind kept working even as the body tried to shut down. This was different. This was the specific wakefulness of someone whose nervous system had received information it couldn't process passively, that required sitting upright with the lights on and the folder open on the kitchen table, and a yellow legal pad filling up with notes and handwriting that got smaller and more precise as the hours passed. She went through the documents 3 times. Then she went through them a 4th time, looking only at the inconsistencies, real or potential, the things that could be explained by legitimate structuring, the things that couldn't. Shell entities were not by themselves evidence of wrongdoing. Cross-collateralization of assets was aggressive but not inherently fraudulent. The question was disclosure, Dutz. What had been disclosed to the consortium, what the consortium's agreements required to be disclosed, and whether what she was looking at represented a genuine omission or a competitor's careful selection of documents designed to look like one. By 3 in the morning, she had a list of 7 specific things she needed to verify. By 4, she had identified the 3 attorneys' names on the transaction documents and run them through every accessible professional database. 2 of them were real, licensed, traceable, active. One of them she could not find in any jurisdiction's professional records. A non-existent attorney on a transaction document was either a clerical error or a fabrication. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. She didn't call Alessandro. She had decided very specifically not to call Alessandro until she had independent verification of something, either the document's validity or their falsity, because calling him now would either warn him if the documents were real or show her hand on an investigation she was conducting, or both. She called instead the one person she trusted to read financial documents with complete neutrality and no stake in the outcome. Petra Solano answered on the third ring, which meant she was awake, which meant she was in her home office doing whatever it was forensic accountants did at 4 in the morning. Isabella, I need a document review, Monday morning. Can you do it? A pause. How sensitive? Potentially very. Send me what you have. Isabella photographed every page of the folder and sent it. Then she put the folder in her bag, turned off the kitchen light, and lay on the couch without taking her shoes off and looked at the ceiling until the light changed. Petra called at 8:47 Monday morning. Isabella was already at her desk. The third attorney, Petra said without preamble, Richard Caswell, listed as counsel on the lien instrument. I ran him through 4 jurisdictions. He doesn't exist. I found the same thing. The lien instrument without a verifiable attorney of record is void on its face. But that's almost secondary. The document itself has 2 formatting inconsistencies that don't match the standard instrument used by the county recorder's office for this type of filing. The margins are off. And the recording stamp date is in a format the county switched away from 18 months ago. A brief pause. Someone who knows how these documents look but didn't check the current format. Isabella breathed. So it's fabricated. The lien instrument is fabricated. The shell entity filings I can't confirm either way. Those are real entities. They just don't necessarily have the relationship to Bella Vista that the document implies. Someone built a real-looking structure around a falsified core instrument. How long would it take to build? To build convincingly enough to fool a non-specialist? A few days. Maybe less if you had the right template. Another pause. This is vain, isn't it? I don't have that confirmed. Isabella. I don't have it confirmed, she said again. Thank you, Petra. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk, looking at nothing, running the revised architecture through her mind. Not Alessandro defrauding the consortium. Dominic Vane fabricating evidence that Alessandro was defrauding the consortium. 2 completely different situations requiring completely different responses, and she had been holding the wrong one for 18 hours. She thought about what Dominic had said at the coffee table. Alessandro Vieri is a man with very sophisticated instincts for self-preservation. Whatever personal history you may have, it won't factor into how he prioritizes his own interests. Targeted, specific, designed to activate exactly the doubt she was most vulnerable to, the 13-year-old question of whether Alessandro had ever seen her as something worth prioritizing, professional, cold, and it had almost worked. She picked up her phone. She called Alessandro's direct line, the back of the card she'd finally looked at. He answered on the second ring. Isabella, are you in the city? Yes. I need to see you, not the office, somewhere private. A half beat. My building, penthouse level, I'll tell the front desk to expect you. He paused. Are you all right? I'll explain when I get there, she said. The building was on the east side, not showy, which was itself a kind of statement. The lobby was clean and spare, and the man at the front desk had her name and sent her up without any of the performance that insecure wealth sometimes required of its staff. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Alessandro was waiting. He was in the same dark sweater from Raphael's dinner, which meant he'd come from somewhere else this morning, or hadn't. She didn't track his movements. She wasn't going to start now. He looked at her face when she came in, and she watched him read it the way he always read it, and decide not to comment on what he found there. Coffee, he said. Please. She sat at his kitchen table. Different table, same quality of morning light, a view from the floor-to-ceiling windows that took in the whole eastern edge of the city, and she put Dominic Vane's folder on the table. He set coffee in front of her, sat across from her, looked at the folder. Dominic Vane contacted me Sunday morning, she said. He asked me to meet him. He told me you were using Bella Vista as a consolidation vehicle for other interests, leveraging project assets through shell entities without consortium disclosure. She opened the folder and turned it toward him. He provided this as documentation. Alessandro looked at the documents. He didn't touch them immediately. He read from a distance first, which was how she'd always seen him take in new information, the initial assessment before contact. Then he reached forward and pulled the folder closer and went through it page by page with the focused attention of someone who was not performing calm, but actually had it. She drank her coffee and watched him and said nothing. He went through everything twice. He turned back to the lien instrument, the document with the false attorney, and looked at it for a long moment. "Richard Caswell," he said, "doesn't exist." He set the page down. His jaw was set. Not anger, something colder and more deliberate than anger. The Vane Group has been trying to acquire a first-mover position in the premium vineyard corridor for 2 years. Belvista is the anchor property. They made an approach to Meridian Pacific 14 months ago. They were declined. He looked up at her. Dominic is cleaner than Marcus in how he moves, but the objective is the same. "Remove you from the consortium," she said. "Position Vane to step in. With your firm's credibility intact so the legitimate capital stays in place." He said it flatly. "You're the bridge. That's why he came to you specifically." She had already understood this, but hearing it stated by someone else, by Alessandro directly, without any visible management of how it might land, made the specific shape of it more concrete. "He nearly succeeded," she said. Alessandro looked at her. "But you verified." "I verified." She picked up the coffee. "I want to be clear with you about something. I verified because the documents had inconsistencies that were visible on close reading, not because I was certain ahead of the evidence that you wouldn't do this." He held her gaze. "I understand." "I'm not sure you do. I'm telling you that given my history of not trusting you, and given that the documents were constructed to specifically activate that distrust, you came close to being removed from this project on the basis of fabricated evidence that I almost accepted. That's a real thing that almost happened, and I think you should know it." The silence between them was different from their usual silences, not charged exactly, but weighted, full of the specific honesty of two people who had just navigated something dangerous together without having agreed to be on the same side first. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to expose it," she said. "Cleanly and publicly enough that Dominic can't reframe it, which means I need documentation of the Vane Group's prior approach to Meridian Pacific, the decline, and the fabrication. The attorney and the date format issue are enough to establish the document is false. The motive is established by the approach history. Put those together in front of the consortium before Dominic can move again, and the Vane Group is out of the Belvista space for the foreseeable future." Alessandro was quiet for a moment. "If we bring this to Meridian Pacific without preparation, they'll freeze the project while they investigate." "Yes." "Belvista has a critical vendor window closing in 18 days. If the project freezes, we lose the first harvest cycle commitment with the agricultural partner. That sets the whole timeline back 11 months. "I know." "You know," he repeated. "So you're proposing to accept potentially 11 months of project delay in order to expose the Vane play." "I'm proposing," Isabella said, "to build the exposure case in parallel with the vendor negotiation so that we can present both to Meridian Pacific simultaneously. Clean project trajectory and clean evidence of the attempt to derail it in one meeting so they never have a reason to freeze anything." She met his eyes. "I can have the evidence brief built in 3 days. You need to get me the Meridian Pacific approach history from 14 months ago, legally, through the consortium attorney, if it's in their records." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing what it had done at Raphael's kitchen, that deep water movement, the thing she could sense without seeing clearly. 3 days is tight. I've done tighter. I know you have." He stood, picked up his coffee, walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the city. His shoulders were held the way she'd learned to recognize, not tension exactly, more like the particular posture of a man who was carrying significant weight and had so much practice with it that the weight had become structural rather than burden. He turned back. "Isabella." "What?" "Why did you come to me first, before the consortium?" She looked at him. "Because if the documents had been real, coming to you first would have given you the opportunity to get ahead of it, which is not something you'd be entitled to. I needed the verification before I decided what the right move was." She paused. "And because it wasn't real, and I wanted you to know what had been attempted before anyone else did." That's a professional answer. It's the professional component. What's the other component? She set down her coffee cup. You said something Saturday night, that you knew what you would do now. She held his gaze and did not look away from it, which took more than she let show. I came to you first because I decided that mattered. I don't know yet what to do with that decision, but I made it. Alessandro looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light, and she could see him arriving at something. Not a conclusion, not the kind of thing that resolved cleanly, but the kind of threshold moment where a decision gets made that will cost you something going forward, regardless of how it turns out. He said, "Tell me what you need." 3 days was not enough, and they made it work anyway. Isabella built the evidence brief at her office, while Alessandro worked through 2 intermediaries to obtain a documented record of the Vane Group's approach to Meridian Pacific, cautiously, through legitimate channels, without triggering any signal that would alert Dominic that the play had been identified. She did not sleep more than 4 hours any of those 3 nights. She ate at her desk. She drank too much coffee and not enough water, and by the second day her hands had a slight tremor that she managed by gripping things firmly and not letting anyone see. On the second day, Dominic Vane texted her, "Have you had time to review the documentation?" She wrote back, "Still reviewing. Need a few more days." He replied, "Of course. Take your time." She stared at those 3 words and felt something cold run through her. Take your time. The language of a man who thought he had already won, who was being gracious about the pace because the outcome wasn't in question. She put the phone face down and went back to work. Alessandro came to her office on the evening of the second day. He didn't call ahead. He knocked on her office door at 7:15 while her assistant had already gone home and the floor was mostly dark. She called "Come in" without looking up, assuming it was the building security doing rounds. He stood in the doorway. He had a container of food from somewhere, restaurant takeout, something that smelled like actual cooking rather than whatever her body had been surviving on for 48 hours. She looked up from the brief, looked at the food, looked at him. "You look like you've been awake for 60 hours, he said. 48. That's not better. He set the food on the edge of her desk. He didn't sit down, didn't make a thing of the gesture, just put it there and then moved to look at the evidence brief laid out across her second desk. The auxiliary workspace she used for physical documents when the logic of something needed to be visible in space rather than on a screen. He read what was there. She watched him read it. He didn't touch anything, just stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and read, his eyes moving the way they did when he was actually absorbing rather than performing absorption. "The attorney timeline," he said. "You're using the county recorder's format change as the anchor. It's the cleanest provable fact. Everything else requires inference. The format change is documented administrative record. Here's what the county used before. Here's when they changed. Here's what Dominic's document shows. It doesn't require the jury to make a judgment call. Consortiums aren't juries. No, but Martin Chu thinks like one. He wants something he can point to that doesn't require interpretation." She pulled out the page in question and turned it toward Alessandro. "This is that thing." He looked at it. "Yes, it is." He looked at the overall layout. "You're ready to present. Tomorrow if you have the approach history documents." "I have them." He pulled an envelope from his inner jacket pocket and set it on the desk next to the food. Consortium attorney provided a certified copy this afternoon. The approach, the proposal, the formal decline, all dated and executed. She picked up the envelope, looked at the date stamps through the thin paper. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll call Martin tonight. Set at 9 o'clock. She nodded. She put the envelope down and looked at the food and looked at the brief and felt for a moment. Just a moment. Just the specific length of a breath. The full weight of what the past 72 hours had been. Not the fear which she'd managed, not the anger which she'd used, but the exhaustion underneath both of them, the particular physical accounting of what it cost to run at this intensity when you hadn't slept and hadn't eaten and hadn't allowed yourself to feel anything except the momentum of forward motion. Alessandro was looking at her. He said nothing. He just looked at her with the directness that she'd spent 13 years finding unbearable, and had somewhere in the past month started to find something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. She was too tired for the defensive architecture. The walls were still technically up, but they were unmanned, and she was too depleted to care about the gap. "Eat," he said. Just that. She opened the container and ate while she worked, and Alessandro sat in the chair across from the auxiliary desk and read back through her brief from the beginning, and they did not talk except about the work. And it was the most comfortable Isabella had felt in a room with another person in longer than she could currently calculate. The 9 o'clock meeting at Meridian Pacific the following morning had the quality of a room that sensed it was about to be realigned without knowing why. Martin Chu brought 2 people she hadn't met, a consortium attorney named Bridget Farrow, who had the precise and compressed energy of someone who billed by 6-minute increments and meant it, and a financial analyst named Chen, whose role seemed to be verification. Isabella had brought Petra. Alessandro came alone. Martin looked at the assembled group with the slight wariness of a project manager who had called a meeting based on someone else's urgent request and was not entirely sure what he was walking into. "Isabella, Alessandro, you wanted to meet. We need to brief you on an attempted interference with the Bella Vista project," Isabella said. She set the evidence brief on the table. "In the interest of efficiency, I'll walk you through the sequence and then we can take questions." She walked them through it. 22 minutes, no theater, just the sequence of events and the documentation that supported each point. The Vane Group's prior approach to Meridian Pacific. Bridget Farrow's expression sharpened when that page appeared, recognition arriving. The formal decline, the fabricated lien instrument presented to Isabella by Dominic Vane as evidence of Alessandro's alleged misconduct, the county recorder format inconsistency, the non-existent attorney, Petra's independent verification. When she finished, the room was quiet. Martin was looking at the false lien instrument. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, which was unusual for Martin, who processed out loud. Bridget Farrow said, "The non-existent attorney is sufficient to void this instrument on its face. The format issue establishes it as fabricated rather than simply defective." She looked at Alessandro. "Did Dominic Vane make any direct approach to you?" "No," Alessandro said. "He went to Isabella," which was strategic. She's the independent partner with the least existing loyalty to either the Vian Group or to me, and the most professional standing to trigger a consortium review if she brought concerns forward. "He used me as the mechanism," Isabella said. "If I'd accepted the documents at face value and brought them to you, Martin, the project would have frozen during investigation. Vane steps in during the freeze. By the time the documents were identified as fabricated, the momentum has already shifted." Martin set the document down. He rubbed the space between his eyes with 2 fingers, a gesture Isabella had never seen from him, which meant the composure was taking effort. "I need to make a call this morning." "We expected that," Isabella said. "We'll wait." Martin left the room. Bridget Farrow and Chen moved into a side conversation over the documents. Alessandro sat across from Isabella, and she looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. Martin returned in 14 minutes. His expression had been reset. Whatever the call had resolved had given him a direction, and Martin with a direction was considerably easier to read than Martin without one. "The consortium's position," he said, sitting down, "is that this constitutes an actionable interference attempt by the Vane Group. Bridget's going to advise on remedies. In the meantime, the Bella Vista project continues on its current timeline." He looked at both of them. "The vendor window is intact," Isabella said. "I confirmed the agricultural partner commitment yesterday. We're still in the window." "Good." He looked at Alessandro. "I owe you an apology." "You didn't know," Alessandro said. "I should have flagged the prior Vane approach more clearly when your co-investment came in. I thought it was resolved." He paused. "I underestimated Dominic." "Most people do," Alessandro said. "That's his method." The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. By the time it ended, Bridget Farrow had the documentation necessary for the consortium's legal action, and the project calendar was confirmed through Phase 1 completion. Isabella shook hands with everyone and said the appropriate things and walked out of the building beside Alessandro into the mid-morning air. She stopped on the sidewalk. She breathed. The air was cold and sharp, and it hit her lungs like something she hadn't been getting enough of for 3 days. Alessandro stopped beside her. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. She was exhausted in a way that had moved past the physical, into some other category of depletion that she didn't have regular access to, because she didn't usually allow herself to run long enough to find it. Her hands, now that she was no longer required to hold anything steady, had resumed the faint tremor of the past 48 hours. She put them in her coat pockets. Alessandro was looking at her. She knew what she looked like. She'd seen herself in the Meridian Pacific bathroom before the meeting and had made a clinical assessment. Functional, credible, visibly running on reserves. She'd looked worse. She'd looked worse and delivered better presentations than the one she'd just given. "You need to sleep," he said. "I know. Before you go back to the office." "Alessandro." "Isabella." She looked at him. He looked back. And she was too tired, genuinely too depleted to maintain the specific architecture of distance that had been the grammar of their interactions for 13 years. The walls were unmanned, the locks were still technically engaged, but her hands were in her pockets, and she couldn't feel the keys. "What are we doing?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her with the patient directness that she'd stopped being able to categorize as dangerous and had started being unable to categorize at all. "What do you want to do?" he said. "That's not an answer." "I know." He paused. "I'm asking because I've been making assumptions about what you want for long enough that I'd rather hear it." She looked at him on the sidewalk in the cold morning air, the city moving around them with its usual indifference. She thought about 16 years old and 3 pages of careful handwriting and the silence that had followed. She thought about the anger she'd built on top of that silence, the architecture of it, the way it had shaped her in ways she could identify and ways she couldn't. She thought about Dominic Vane's 3 words, "Take your time," and the assumption underneath them, the certainty that she would be predictable, that her doubt would be her mechanism. She thought about the 72 hours she'd just been through and the fact that the person she had trusted to receive the worst-case scenario first, before the consortium, before anyone else, was the same person she'd spent 13 years not trusting. "I don't know what I want," she said. "That's honest. I know that something has changed and I don't have language for it yet." She met his eyes. "I know that I'm not angry at you anymore. I don't know what's under the anger because I haven't been not angry at you in 13 years. She breathed. "That's where I am." Alessandro was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence, that was presence, the thing he did where he was actually in the space and not managing it. "There's a place," he said. "The Bella Vista estate. I've been going out there once a week during the project, not for work, just to walk the property, to understand what we're building." He paused. "Come with me this weekend. Not for the project, just to see it." She looked at him. "No agenda," he said. "No documentation. No Marcus Vane. No Dominic Vane. No briefing materials." She should say she'd think about it. She should give herself space and time, and the protective uncertainty that had been her reliable tool for navigating anything Alessandro adjacent. She looked at his face in the cold morning air, the controlled stillness, the direct eyes, the things she could sense moving in the deep water of him, and felt the exhaustion make her honest in a way that rest might have let her avoid. "Okay," she said. He nodded once. "Saturday morning. I'll send you the address." She pulled her coat tighter and started toward the corner where she'd parked. She'd gone 3 steps when Alessandro said her name, and she stopped and turned. He was standing where she'd left him. He looked at her across the short distance of sidewalk, and his expression was the most open she'd ever seen it. Not unguarded exactly, because this was Alessandro and unguarded was not a mode he had available, but something close, something that was doing its best with the equipment it had. "I read your letter," he said. She went still. "Raphael didn't destroy it," he said. "He kept it. He gave it to me 6 months ago." He held her gaze. I've had it since June. The air between them had the quality of held breath. She looked at him and felt the specific sensation of the last structural piece of a 13-year architecture shifting, the load redistributing, the whole thing changing shape. 6 months, she said. Yes. You've known for 6 months. Yes. And you didn't... I didn't know how to begin, he said. And then Belvista happened, and then you were right in front of me, and I still didn't know how to begin. And then Raphael's dinner happened, and you told me yourself, and I realized... He stopped. The pause was not performance. It was someone who chose words carefully running out of the careful ones. I realized I'd been waiting for permission to begin, and you were the only person who could give it. She stood on the sidewalk with the cold air in her lungs, and the city moving past them in the full weight of 6 months and 13 years, and 3 pages of careful handwriting somewhere in the history between them. What did it say? She said. The letter. You know what it said. I want to hear you say it. He looked at her for a long moment, and then Alessandro Vieri, who had controlled one of the most significant criminal empires in the northeastern United States for 4 years, who had never once in Isabella's memory allowed himself to be visibly unmade by anything, said, It said you saw me. Not what I was going to become. Not what my family was. Just me. His voice was even, but barely. It said you wanted me to see you back. Isabella stood with that. Saturday, she said. Saturday, he confirmed. She turned the corner and walked to her car and sat in the driver's seat and put both hands on the wheel and did not move for a full minute, which was longer than she'd been still in 3 days, and she breathed, and outside the window the city went on doing what it always did, and somewhere across the sidewalk Alessandro Vieri was standing in the cold morning air, having just said the most honest thing she had ever heard from him. She slept for 11 hours. She didn't mean to. She drove home from the Meridian Pacific building, told herself she would lie down for an hour before going back to the office to close out the project documentation, and woke up at 6:40 in the evening with her coat still on and her shoes still on and the afternoon light gone completely from the windows. She lay there in the dark for a moment, taking inventory. The specific physical sensation of a body that had finally stopped running and was now presenting its bill. Her shoulders ached, her eyes were dry. Her hands, when she held them up in the dark, were finally still. She thought about Alessandro saying, I read your letter. She got up, took off her coat, took off her shoes, and stood in her kitchen in the dark drinking water from a glass she'd filled 3 times before the thirst felt answered. She looked out the window at the city lights. She thought about 6 months, about the distance between June and now, the meetings and the arguments, and the Tuesday morning at Belvista when the estate had smelled like cold stone and old wood, and she'd been aware of Alessandro the way she was always aware of Alessandro, with the precision of something calibrated. All of it happening while he had her letter, while he had been carrying what she'd written at 16 in his inner pocket or his desk drawer or wherever a man like Alessandro kept the things that mattered. She didn't know what to do with that. She added it to the collection of things she didn't know what to do with, which had been growing since the Meridian Gala. And she went to bed properly this time and slept again, and in the morning she felt like a person who had come back from somewhere far. She called Raphael on Thursday. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting, which meant he'd known she'd call when she was ready, and had been watching his phone with a hope he was too careful to name. Isabella. I'm not there yet, she said. I want you to know that. I don't have the full thing available to give you yet. A pause. Okay. But I called. So that's where I am. That's enough. His voice was rough at the edges. Raphael, who felt everything too close to the surface, who had probably spent the past week in the particular misery of someone waiting to find out whether they were going to be forgiven. That's more than I expected. Don't do that, she said. Don't make it less than it is just because you're relieved. What you did was significant. I know. And I need you to sit with that, not to resolve it for both of us, just to sit with it. I am sitting with it, he said quietly. I've been sitting with it for 20 years, Isabella, not consciously, but somewhere. He paused. I saw the way you were after that summer, the way you got harder. I told myself it was growing up. I told myself it was who you were becoming. His voice broke slightly, just at the edge of the word. I knew. I think I always knew. She stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and the morning coming through the window and let that land without trying to manage it. Alessandro told me you gave it to him, she said. In June. Silence. Why then? She said. Raphael breathed, a long breath, the kind that was buying time and also genuinely needed. Because I had lunch with him in May, and something he asked about you. Not how you were doing, not the professional version. He asked how you were actually doing, and the way he asked it, he stopped. I'd been his best friend for 30 years, Isabella. I know what Alessandro looks like when something matters to him and he's not saying it. I know that look. And I went home and I found the letter. I'd kept it in a box. I don't know why. I couldn't throw it away. And I sent it to him the next week. Without telling me. Without telling you. Another pause. That was another mistake. I think I was hoping it would fix itself. That whatever happened would happen, and then the thing I did wouldn't need to be said because you'd both be... He stopped again. I know. I know that's not how it works. No, she said. It isn't. They were quiet for a moment. Outside her window, a pigeon landed on the ledge and then left, uninterested. Raphael, she said. Yeah. Thank you for giving it to him. She could hear him trying to decide what to do with that. The relief of it, the insufficient smallness of it against the size of what preceded it. He settled on silence, which was the right choice. I'll call you next week, she said. We'll have dinner. Okay, he said. Okay, yeah. She hung up and stood with the phone in her hand for a moment, and then put it down on the counter and got dressed for work. Saturday came the way it was always going to come. Without ceremony, without the emotional weather she'd half expected. Just the ordinary fact of a morning that happened to be significant. She drove herself. Alessandro had sent the address and told her 8 o'clock, early enough to have the property before the light shifted, and she arrived at 8:04 on a road she'd been on once before, on the gray Tuesday in October when the vines had been dormant and the estate building had smelled like cold stone. The vines were not dormant now. Late November. They'd been pruned back to the cane structure for winter, rows of them along the hillside with a geometric precision that was almost architectural, and the morning light came in at a low angle that caught the wire between the posts and made the whole hillside look like it was threaded with something. Isabella sat in her car at the estate gate for a moment and looked at it. Alessandro's car was already parked near the estate building. He was standing outside it, not waiting with any visible impatience, just standing with a coffee cup and looking at the same hillside she'd been looking at. He heard her pull up and turned. She got out. You came, he said. I said I would. You did. He offered the coffee cup. She took it, drank, handed it back. The coffee was good. She noted this without particular surprise. The East Row, he said, and started walking, and she walked beside him. They walked the property for an hour. Not the professional circuit she'd done in October. That had been purposeful, infrastructure-focused, assessing the relationship between the estate building and the event spaces and the access road capacity. This was different. This was the pace of someone who had been walking this specific ground once a week and knew where the grade changed and where the drainage went and where the vines on the north-facing slope produced something different from their identical-looking neighbors on the south face. Alessandro talked about it with the kind of knowledge that only came from repeated attention. Not technical, or not only technical, but the knowledge you built when you kept coming back to something because it meant something, not because you had to. She listened. She asked questions when she had them. She did not perform engagement, she was actually engaged, which surprised her a little, the specificity of her interest. She had assessed this property twice in the past 2 months and thought she understood it. She understood it differently now, walking it at his pace. They ended at the old stone bench at the edge of the estate's eastern terrace, which overlooked the longest row of vines, and beyond them, the valley that the property's elevation gave access to. Isabella sat on the bench. Alessandro sat beside her. Not close. The bench was long and there was a foot of distance between them, which was its own kind of statement about where they were. The morning had warmed slightly. Not warm. It was late November. But the specific cold of early morning had eased, and the air had the quality of something that had decided to cooperate. "You've had it for 6 months," she said. He didn't need context. "Yes. I want to know what you did with it, not where you kept it, what you did with it." She looked at the vines. "Whether you read it once and put it away, or whether you—" She stopped. "I read it the night Raphael gave it to me," he said. "I read it 3 times that night, and then I put it in my desk at home. And I took it out, I don't know, periodically." He paused. "When things were difficult sometimes, when I was managing something large and needed to remember what I was managing it for." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the valley. His profile in the morning light was the same profile she'd been looking at since she was a child. The same structure, the same controlled quality, the same sense of something substantial behind the surface. She had spent so many years cataloging what she found there that she sometimes couldn't tell what she was actually seeing from what she remembered. "You used my letter to remind yourself what you were working for," she said. "Yes." "Alessandro," she breathed. "That's—" She didn't have the word. She sat with the absence of the word for a moment. "You should have told me. In June, when you first read it. You should have found a way to tell me." "I know. I spent 2 more months hating you." "I know that too." His jaw was set. "I didn't know how to begin it. I've already told you that. I'm not offering it as an excuse. I'm telling you it was the specific failure." He turned to look at her then. "I waited too long in too many directions where you're concerned, Isabella. At 21. In June. I have a history of deciding the timing wasn't right and then the timing becoming worse." She looked at him. "Why? Why do I wait?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She could tell the difference. He was being precise, finding the specific true thing rather than the available true adjacent thing. "Because you mattered more than the risk," he said. "And the more someone matters, the more you can lose by moving wrong. So you don't move. And not moving turns out to be its own kind of loss, which you only understand in retrospect." She sat with that. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I've had 20 years to arrive at it." She looked out at the vines. A bird moved through the row nearest them. Quick, purposeful, gone. The valley beyond the property line held the morning light in a way that made it look like the light had settled there and intended to stay. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay." "I built my whole professional identity on what I thought happened between us." She said it plainly, the way you said a thing that needed to be out in the air more than it needed to be beautiful. "The person I became. The hardness of it, the control, the refusal to need anything from anyone. That was my response to a rejection that didn't happen. I made myself out of something false." She paused. "I don't regret who I am. I'm good at what I do and I worked for it, and I don't want to frame it as damage. But I want you to understand what was underneath it, what I was running on." "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm not sure you do entirely, because it means that the most significant relationship of my professional life, my firm, everything I built, was built partly in response to you, to the absence of you." She looked at him. "That's a complicated thing to hand someone." Alessandro looked at her for a long moment. "You built something extraordinary," he said. "Whatever you built it on." "That's not the point." "I know it's not. The point is you want me to understand the cost." He held her gaze. "I understand the cost. I'm telling you I don't want to be the reason you minimize what you built." She breathed. "I'm not minimizing it. I'm accounting for it accurately. Those are different things." "Yes," he said. "They are. You're right." She looked at her hands. They were still this morning, the tremor gone with the sleep debt it had been traveling with. She turned them over, looked at the palms, looked at the specific reality of her own hands in the morning light on a bench at a vineyard that she and this man were building together. "Where do we go from here?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "I know where I want to go. I don't want to tell you that before I know what you want." "That's becoming a pattern." "It's a pattern I've thought about," he said. "I've decided I'd rather be honest about waiting than dishonest about certainty." She looked at him. "I want to not be angry anymore," she said. That's the first thing. I want to set down the 13 years of it. I want to try whatever this is without carrying all of that. She paused. I don't know if I can yet. The anger is structural. Taking it out changes the shape of things. Then we take it out slowly, he said. We see what the shape is. She looked at the valley. The light had shifted slightly. It was past 9 now, and the angle had changed, the way it did in November when the sun stayed low all day. Somewhere in the row of vines a branch moved, though there was no wind she could feel. I kept the drafts, she said. He turned to look at her. The drafts of the letter. I wrote it 4 times before the version I left under your door. She hadn't told anyone this. She hadn't thought about it consciously in years. The way you put things in deep storage and forget the storage exists until something opens the door. I kept them in the back of a notebook. I don't know if I still have the notebook. I probably do. I keep everything. Alessandro was very still. I was 16 and I wrote 4 drafts of a letter telling you I loved you, she said. And then I wrote the final version and slid it under a door, and then I spent the next 20 years telling myself the girl who wrote those drafts was someone I'd outgrown. She felt the sentence in her chest as she said it, the specific weight of it, what it cost to say out loud. I don't think I outgrew her. I think I buried her. Alessandro reached over, not quickly, not dramatically. He reached over with the same economy he brought to everything and put his hand over hers where it rested on the bench between them. His hand was warm. The warmth of it was specific and present, and more than she'd allowed herself in longer than she could honestly calculate. She looked at his hand over hers. She did not pull away. She wrote a good letter, he said. Something cracked open in Isabella's chest. Not loudly, not the way things broke in movies, with sound and drama and a visible moment of collapse. It cracked open the way things did in real life, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary sentence, in the morning light on a cold bench with a man's warm hand over hers. She did not cry. She was not going to cry. But her throat tightened and she breathed through it, and she turned her hand over slowly under his until her palm was against his palm, and she held on. They sat there for a while. The Bella Vista grand opening was 7 months later, on a warm evening in June that had the quality of a night the season had been building toward. The kind of evening where the light seemed to decide to stay past when it was expected, where the air had a softness that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite anything else. The vines had leafed out fully over the spring, and the hillside that had been geometric and bare in November was now dense and green, and the estate building had been opened and restored and lit from within so that it glowed in the dusk like something that had been waiting to be found. There were 200 guests, not the 400 of a Marcus Vane gala. Isabella had argued for the smaller number at the planning stage, and Alessandro had agreed immediately, the first time she'd proposed a number he hadn't questioned. The people here were curated, journalists from the publications that shaped the hospitality conversation, buyers from the premium wine market, the consortium partners and their significant others, a handful of figures from Alessandro's world who traveled under the radar and understood discretion, and Raphael, who arrived early and stood near the entrance with the slightly bewildered happiness of a man who had been allowed back into something he'd feared was closed to him. Isabella had spoken to Raphael 7 times in the 7 months since she'd called him. Dinner twice, calls the other times. It was not the relationship they'd had before. She didn't know yet if that relationship could be rebuilt or if what replaced it would be something different, not lesser, but different. The way a bone that heals after breaking is never quite the same bone, but is functional in ways the broken one wasn't. She was willing to find out. That was where she was. She was willing. At the opening, she found him near the terrace and stood beside him for a moment looking at the vineyard. "You built this," he said. "We built it," she said. "Alessandro and the consortium." "You," he said again. "I know what your contribution was. Martin Chu told me when I ran into him at the bar." He glanced at her. He said, "Without your work on the interference case, the project would have been 18 months behind and a different shape entirely." Martin talks too much. Martin talks exactly the right amount. Raphael looked out at the vines. The light was doing the thing it did in June, holding on past sunset, finding angles that didn't exist at other times of year. Are you happy? She thought about the question, not reflexively. She actually thought about it, which was itself notable, because for most of her adult life, the question had been one she'd deflected without engaging. I'm somewhere I didn't expect to be, she said. That's not unhappy. He nodded. He accepted that answer with the grace of a man who had learned, painfully, not to push past what was offered. I'm glad you're here, he said. Both of you. She looked at him. Raphael? Yeah. I forgive you, she said. I want you to know that. It took a while to get there, and I'm not saying the distance was nothing, but I'm saying it now. He looked at her. His eyes were wet, the lamplight from the estate building catching the brightness of it. He didn't try to speak immediately, which was the right choice, because Raphael, when moved, was not a quiet man, and right now he needed to be. Okay, he said finally, rough. Okay. She put her hand on his arm briefly, just briefly. Then she moved away toward the terrace because they were both better served by the moment ending cleanly than by extending it until one of them undid it. Alessandro found her at the edge of the terrace, looking at the valley the way she'd been looking at it since November, with the specific attention of someone who kept finding something new in a thing they'd already seen many times. Martin wants to make remarks, he said. About 5 minutes. Okay. He stood beside her, close enough that their arms were almost touching, a proximity that would have been charged 7 months ago and was now simply the ordinary gravity of two people who had made a habit of standing near each other. She was aware of it the way she was aware of breathing, constant, present, not remarkable. You're somewhere far, he said. I'm here, she said. I'm just also thinking. About what? She looked at the valley. That summer, she said. The summer I wrote the letter. I remember writing the last draft and thinking that once it was under the door, the thing I felt would stop being only mine, that it would be shared, that even if you said no, at least the feeling would have been named out loud to someone. She paused. I thought about that a lot this winter, about how much of what I carried was just unwitnessed, things I felt that no one ever knew I felt. I know now, he said. You know now, she agreed. That's different from not being known at all. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Isabella. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the open quality she'd first seen on the Meridian Pacific sidewalk, the thing that was doing its best with the equipment it had, the particular effort of a man who had spent a lifetime keeping his face controlled, now choosing, deliberately, to let something through. I want to say something, he said, in case I've been waiting for the right time again. And the right time is actually just now. Say it, she said. I see you, he said. I have always seen you. Not who I hoped you'd be, not a version of you that was convenient for my life. You. He held her gaze. I saw you at 16 when I knew I couldn't say so. I saw you every time I saw you in the years after that. I saw who you became, and I understood, in ways I couldn't account for at the time, that I had some responsibility for the particular shape of who you became. And He paused. The pause was doing work. I'm not going to ask you to set that down because it's inconvenient for where we are now. It's the truth, and you get to carry it as long as you need to. He breathed. But I see you, and I'm not looking away. Isabella stood on the terrace in the June evening with that in the air between them. She had written at 16 that she wanted him to see her. She had written it in careful handwriting on good paper and folded it and slid it under a door and waited. And the waiting had turned into years, and the years had turned into who she was now. This specific person, flawed and capable, and still learning to put down the armor in rooms where it wasn't needed. I know, she said. She reached up and put her hand against his face, the same gesture she had imagined at 16 and never allowed herself at 36. And the reality of it was different from imagination, the way all real things were different, more textured and more ordinary and more than she'd calculated. His face was warm. He turned his head slightly, leaning into the touch, and something in the deliberateness of that small movement, the choice in it, the way he let it mean what it meant, landed in her chest and stayed. She kissed him. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in the things she'd watched when she was young, and believed that significant moments announced themselves with appropriate music and light. It was quiet. His hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his jaw, and he kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything. Present, focused, without performance. The evening around them held its temperature. Somewhere inside the estate building, she could hear the low sound of 200 people gathered around something they'd made. She pulled back. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Martin's going to start without us," she said. "Let him." She smiled. She didn't reach for it or manage it. It arrived without permission, the kind of smile she hadn't used often enough to recognize quickly. She saw him see it, saw something move in his face in response. "Alessandro," she said. "Yes. Don't wait next time." "I won't," he said. "I'm done waiting." They went inside, eventually. Martin made his remarks, and they were good. He was better with a room than he let on in meetings. Funnier, the kind of dry wit that required an audience to find its range. The guests moved through the estate building and onto the terrace and down to the vine rows for the guided tasting that the Belvista team had organized with the obsessive detail of people who understood that first impressions at this price point were irreversible. Isabella stood with Alessandro through most of the evening. Not attached, she moved through the room independently, talked to the people she needed to talk to, stayed in conversations as long as they were worth having, and exited them when they weren't. But she found him periodically, across rooms or on the terrace or at the long table where the premium reserve pour was happening. Found him and stayed near him for a moment and then moved on. The finding was easy. It had always been easy to locate him in a room. What had changed was what the locating felt like. An hour before the evening ended, she found a quiet corner of the terrace and stood alone for a few minutes. She needed it. The sociability of the evening had been real, but it cost something, and she'd learned over the years to find the edge of the room when the account ran low. The valley was dark now, the vines only visible as a suggestion of structure against the lighter darkness of the sky. The estate lights behind her made the terrace a warm island in all that dark. She thought about the letter, not the fact of it. She'd thought about the fact of it enough in 7 months to have metabolized most of what needed metabolizing. She thought about the act of writing it. 16 years old at a desk somewhere, taking her own interior life seriously enough to put it on paper, seriously enough to fold it and carry it down a hallway and slide it under a door. She thought about the courage in that, which she hadn't been able to recognize for 20 years because she'd been too busy managing the aftermath of what she'd believed was the response. The courage had been real. The girl had been real. The things she'd felt had been real. She was still that girl in the ways that mattered. Under the firm and the control and the 11 years of building something out of her own ability and will, she was still someone who took her own interior life seriously enough to name it. She was still someone who, when it finally became possible, was willing to slide the letter under the door. Alessandro appeared at the edge of the terrace. He looked at her across the distance, read something in her face. He was always reading her face she'd stopped minding, and came to stand beside her. "Everyone's moving inside for dessert," he said. "One more minute?" He stood with her. He didn't look at the dark valley with the practiced interest of someone waiting for her to be ready. He actually looked at it, the same attention he gave everything, as though the dark vineyard in November was as worth looking at as the full one in June. She appreciated that about him, the completeness of his attention, the way he brought all of it to whatever he was looking at, without performing the bringing. "The letter is in my desk," he said. "At home." "I know. You told me." "I want you to know I'm keeping it." She looked at him. "I know that too. And that if you want it back—" "I don't want it back," she said. "It was always for you." He looked at her. The terrace light found the line of his face and the warmth in his eyes that he no longer worked to conceal, at least not from her, at least not in the private moments that had been accumulating between them since November. 7 months of private moments, mornings at Belvista and working dinners, and one unremarkable Wednesday evening when she'd fallen asleep on his couch, reading a vendor contract and woken up with a blanket over her that she hadn't put there. Small things. The small things were what the large things were made of. "Ready?" he said. "Almost," she said. She stood for another moment with the dark valley in front of her and the warm estate behind her and Alessandro beside her, and she held all of it. The girl who'd written the letter, the woman who'd built something out of the years that followed, The anger that had been love with nowhere to go. The 3 pages of careful handwriting that had traveled such a strange distance to arrive where they were. She held all of it and did not try to make it simpler than it was, or tidier than it was, or resolved in ways it hadn't resolved. It was not a clean story. It was not a story that made sense at every seam. It was the story of 2 people who had spent 20 years being wrong about each other in different directions and had arrived finally at a morning on a stone bench when a hand had turned over in another hand. That was enough. That was, she thought, more than enough. She turned from the valley. "Ready," she said. They went inside together, into the warmth and the light and the sound of 200 people gathered around something that had been built carefully and with intention and would last, if tended, for a very long time. The letter the Mafia Boss never received had finally, after 20 years and 3 pages and every mile of distance between them, found its way home.